the story of creation Genesis. In the beginning, there was nothing but God. No light, no darkness, no sky, no earth. There was only the void, empty and formless. The deep waters lay shrouded in darkness, and over these waters, the Spirit of God moved, hovering like a gentle wind across the face of the deep. Then God spoke. His voice broke the silence of eternity. He said, "Let there be light." And there was light. The light came into being at his command, piercing through the darkness that had filled everything. God looked upon the light and saw that it was good. He saw its brilliance, its purity, its beauty. And God made a separation. He divided the light from the darkness, creating distinction where there had been only uniformity. God called the light day. He called the darkness night. And this naming was important, for in naming them, he gave them purpose and identity. The light had its time, and the darkness had its time. The evening came, bringing shadows and rest. Then the morning came, bringing brightness and renewal. This was the first day, the very first measure of time in all creation. The second day began with God's voice once more. He said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." So God made the firmament, a great expanse stretching across the void. This firmament separated the waters above from the waters below. Above the firmament, waters remained, held in place by God's command. Below the firmament, waters gathered, vast and deep. God called this firmament heaven. It was the sky, the atmosphere, the great space between the earth below and the heavens above. The evening came, and the morning followed. This was the second day. On the third day, God spoke again. He said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." The waters moved at his word. They flowed together, collecting in great basins and valleys. As the waters gathered, dry ground emerged, rising up from beneath the seas. Mountains formed, hills arose, plains stretched out. The land took shape, solid and firm. God called the dry land earth. He called the gathering of water seas. And God looked upon what he had made and saw that it was good. The earth stood ready, waiting, prepared for what would come next. But God was not finished with the third day. He spoke once more, saying, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself, upon the earth." And it happened just as he commanded. The earth responded to God's voice. From the soil, tiny shoots began to emerge. Grass appeared, covering the bare ground with green. Herbs sprouted, each one carrying within it the seeds of its own kind. Trees pushed up from the earth, their roots spreading deep, their branches reaching high. And these trees bore fruit, each according to its own kind. Apple trees bore apples, fig trees bore figs, olive trees bore olives. Within each fruit lay seeds, carrying the promise of more trees, more fruit, more life. God looked upon the vegetation he had created and saw that it was good. The earth was no longer bare and empty. It was clothed in green, adorned with the beauty of growing things. The evening came, and the morning followed. This was the third day. On the fourth day, God spoke to the heavens. He said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights. The greater light he made to rule the day. This was the sun, burning bright, radiating warmth and brilliance. Its light would mark the hours of daylight, the time for work and activity. The lesser light he made to rule the night. This was the moon, reflecting the sun's glory, casting soft light in the darkness. Its phases would mark the passage of time, the turning of months. God also made the stars, countless stars scattered across the vast expanse of heaven. Some were gathered in clusters, others stood alone. Some shone brightly, others glimmered faintly. Each one was placed exactly where God intended, forming patterns in the night sky. God set all these lights in the firmament of heaven. The sun would give light upon the earth by day, the moon and stars by night. They would mark the seasons, the changing of spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring again. They would mark days and years, giving rhythm to creation, providing a way to measure time's passage. God looked upon the sun, moon, and stars, and saw that it was good. The heavens were no longer empty. They were filled with light, with beauty, with purpose. The evening came, and the morning followed. This was the fourth day. On the fifth day, God turned his attention to the waters and the sky. He said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of heaven." The waters came alive at his command. Fish appeared in great multitudes, swimming in the seas. Some were tiny, darting quickly through the water. Others were large, moving slowly through the depths. There were fish of every shape and color, each designed for its own purpose and place. Great sea creatures formed in the deep waters. Whales moved through the ocean, their songs echoing in the depths. Sea monsters inhabited the darkest parts of the sea, mysterious and powerful. Every living creature that moves through the water came into being, each according to its kind. Above, in the sky, birds took flight. Their wings caught the air, lifting them high above the earth. Some birds were small and quick, flitting from branch to branch. Others were large and majestic, soaring on great wings across vast distances. There were birds that sang beautiful songs, birds that hunted in the day, birds that flew in the night. Each bird was made according to its kind, perfectly suited for its life in the air. God looked upon all these creatures of water and sky, and he saw that it was good. Then God blessed them. This was the first blessing, the first benediction spoken over creation. He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." This blessing carried power. It gave the creatures the ability to reproduce, to create more of their kind. Fish would lay eggs, and more fish would hatch. Birds would build nests, and more birds would be born. Generation after generation, they would fill their realms, the fish filling the seas, the birds filling the skies. The evening came, and the morning followed. This was the 5th day. On the 6th day, God spoke to the earth once more. He said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. The earth brought forth living creatures. Animals appeared, walking on the land, each wonderfully made. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds. Lions prowled with strength and majesty. Bears lumbered through forests. Deer leaped gracefully across fields. Elephants moved with power and wisdom. Every wild animal came into being, each suited perfectly for its life. God made cattle according to their kinds. Oxen, sheep, goats, and all domestic animals appeared. These would be animals that could live alongside what was yet to come, creatures that could be tended and cared for. God made everything that creeps upon the earth according to its kind. Insects buzzed and crawled. Lizards scurried across rocks. Snakes slithered through grass. Worms burrowed in the soil. Every small creature, every creeping thing, came into being at God's word. God looked upon all these animals, and he saw that it was good. The earth was now full of life. Plants grew, producing fruit and seed. Fish swam in the seas. Birds flew in the sky. Animals walked on the land. Creation was abundant, rich, teeming with living things. But God was not yet finished. Something was still missing. All that he had made was good, but there was no one to care for it, no one to tend the garden of earth, no one who could know God himself and walk with him. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." This was different from everything else God had spoken. When he made light, he simply commanded it to be. When he made the sky, the land, the seas, he spoke, and they appeared. When he made plants and animals, he told the earth to bring them forth. But now God said, "Let us make." This was personal, intimate, deliberate. God was creating something in his own image, not a copy of his divine nature, but something that would reflect him, that would bear his likeness. This creature would be different from all others. This creature would have understanding, would have the capacity to choose, would have the ability to love and to know love. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This was humanity, made in the very likeness of the Creator. They were formed from the dust of the earth, yet they carried within them something of the divine spark. They were earthly, yet they were more than merely earthly. They were physical, yet they were also spiritual. God blessed them. This was his second blessing, spoken now over humanity. He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." This blessing gave humanity a purpose, a calling. They were to be fruitful, to have children, to multiply, until their descendants filled the earth. They were to subdue the earth, not as tyrants, but as caretakers. They were to have dominion over the animals, to rule over creation as God's representatives, as stewards of all he had made. Then God said to them, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food." And it was so. God provided for his creation. The plants that grew from the earth would sustain life. Humanity could eat the fruit of every tree, the seeds of every plant. The animals could eat the green herbs that covered the earth. There was abundance, provision, sufficiency for all living things. God looked upon everything he had made. He saw the light and the darkness, the sky and the seas, the dry land covered with vegetation. He saw the sun, moon, and stars shining in the heavens. He saw the fish swimming in the waters and the birds flying in the air. He saw the animals walking on the earth, and he saw humanity, made in his image, standing as the crown of his creation. And God saw that it was very good. Not just good, as each previous day had been, but very good. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was perfect, harmonious, complete. The evening came, and the morning followed. This was the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Everything that God had planned to create had been created. Everything he had spoken into being had come into existence. The work of creation was complete. There was a place where the river widened into a pool, deep and still, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. They called this the looking glass, and they would come here to see their reflections, to observe themselves as God had made them. The water was so clear that they could see straight to the bottom, where smooth stones lay and small fish darted about. There was a hill, the highest point in the garden, from which they could see almost everything around them. From this vantage point, they could watch the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening. They could see the river winding through the garden, could trace its path from the center outward to the four directions. They could see the variety of the landscape, the different types of trees, the meadows and groves, the entire scope of their paradise home. They called this place the watching place, and they would climb it often just to see and appreciate the beauty of what God had given them. Every day brought small joys. The taste of a particularly delicious fruit, the sight of a bird building its nest, the feel of grass beneath their feet, the sound of the river flowing, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the cool of the shade on a particularly bright day. These were not extraordinary things, not grand or dramatic, but they brought deep satisfaction and contentment. Adam and his wife talked about everything. They talked about the garden and the animals. They talked about God and his works. They talked about themselves and their relationship. They talked about the future, about the children who would come, about the life that stretched ahead of them, endless and full of possibility. Sometimes they would play, chasing each other through the garden, laughing, delighting in the simple joy of movement and life. They would climb trees just to see what the world looked like from among the branches. They would wade in the river, splashing water at each other. They would lie in the grass and watch clouds drift by, pointing out shapes they saw in the white formations. Work and rest, activity and stillness, all flowed together in natural rhythm. They worked when work was needed, and they rested when they wished to rest. There was no compulsion, no obligation that felt burdensome. Everything they did freely, joyfully, because it was right and good and brought them satisfaction. The presence of God was the foundation of everything. Knowing that he was there, that he walked with them, that he cared for them, gave meaning and purpose to all they did. They were not alone in the universe. They were not isolated beings trying to make sense of existence. They were children of God, living in his presence, secure in his love. Sometimes in the quiet moments, when everything was still and peaceful, they would simply sit and think about the wonder of it all. They had not always existed. There was a time when they were not, and then God spoke and they were. From nothing, from dust, from bone, they had come into being. They had been given life, consciousness, the ability to think and feel and know. They had been given this beautiful world, this perfect garden, this fellowship with the Creator himself. The awareness of God's goodness filled them with gratitude. They had done nothing to earn or deserve what they had been given. It was pure gift, pure grace. God had created them not because he needed them, but because he wanted them. He had placed them in Eden not because he was obligated to provide for them, but because he delighted in their happiness. Every good thing they experienced traced back to God. The beauty they saw was his design. The food they ate was his provision. The love they shared was his gift. The life they lived was his blessing. They owed everything to him, and they knew it, and they were grateful. This gratitude expressed itself in obedience. When God had commanded them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they had accepted his command willingly. They did not question his right to place this boundary. They did not resent the restriction. They understood that God knew what was best for them, that his commands were for their good, that to obey him was to choose life and blessing. The tree stood there in the garden, its fruit visible and accessible. They could see it whenever they passed by, but seeing it did not create desire. The boundary God had established was so clear, so firm in their minds, that they felt no pull toward disobedience. The fruit of that one tree held no appeal when compared to all the other fruits they could freely enjoy. Freedom existed within boundaries. They were free to eat from every tree except one. They were free to go anywhere in the garden. They were free to name the animals, to tend the plants, to explore and discover and create. The one restriction did not diminish their freedom, but defined it, gave it shape and meaning. This was how life was meant to be lived, in relationship with God, in harmony with creation, in fellowship with each other. Every need met, every desire fulfilled in proper ways, every day filled with purpose and joy. This was paradise, and they knew it, and they were content. The animals continued their lives according to their own natures, but always within the order God had established. Birds would build nests in the spring, gathering twigs and grass to create homes for their young. Though there was no death, there was still growth, still multiplication. Eggs would be laid, and new birds would hatch, and the bird population would grow. But the growth was balanced, ordered, never overwhelming the capacity of the garden to support life. Similarly, with all the other animals, they multiplied as God had commanded, but in proportion, in balance. There was always enough food, always enough space, always enough of everything needed for every creature to thrive. The garden seemed to expand to accommodate growth, or perhaps it was simply so vast that there was room beyond measure for all living things. Adam and his wife watched these processes with fascination. They saw how the birds cared for their young, feeding them, protecting them, teaching them to fly. They saw how the deer nursed their fawns, how the lions watched over their cubs. They learned from these observations, understanding something of what it would mean when they too had children to care for. The thought of children brought both anticipation and patience. They knew children would come in God's time. There was no rush, no pressure. Their own relationship was still new, still developing. They were learning each other, learning to be husband and wife, learning to live in the unity God had intended. Children would be an addition to this unity, an expansion of their family, but not a necessity for their happiness. For now, it was enough to be together, to be in the garden, to walk with God. Each day was full, complete in itself. They did not long for something different or something more. They were content with what they had, content with who they were, content with the life they were living. The distinction between work and worship was minimal. When they tended the garden, they were serving God, caring for what He had made. When they named the animals, they were exercising the authority He had given them. When they ate the fruit of the trees, they were receiving His provision with gratitude. Every act was an act of worship, every moment an opportunity to acknowledge God's goodness and respond to His love. In the cool of the day, when God walked in the garden and they walked with Him, they would tell Him about their day. They would show Him what they had done, where they had been, what they had discovered. He would listen with interest, asking questions, offering insights, expressing pleasure in their growth and development. Sometimes, God would tell them things about creation they had not known. He would explain why He had made certain things the way He had made them. He would reveal purposes and patterns they had not yet discovered. He would point out connections and relationships between different parts of creation, showing them the intricate design that undergirded everything. These conversations deepened their understanding not just of creation, but of God Himself. They learned that He was wise beyond measure, that every detail of creation reflected thought and purpose. They learned that He was powerful, able to speak, and have things come into existence. They learned that He was creative, delighting in variety and beauty. They learned that He was good, desiring the happiness and flourishing of all He had made. They learned that God was personal, not distant or removed, but intimately involved with His creation. He cared about details. He noticed when a single flower bloomed. He knew every animal by name. He was aware of everything that happened in the garden, not as a distant observer, but as a caring presence who was actively engaged with His creation. Most of all, they learned that God loved them. This love was not something they earned or had to work to maintain. It simply was. God loved them because He had made them, because they were His, because He had chosen to create them and place them in this garden and walk with them in fellowship. His love was the foundation of everything, the bedrock on which all else was built. This knowledge gave them security. They were not afraid of God, not worried about displeasing Him, not anxious about losing His favor. They knew they were loved, and that knowledge freed them to be fully themselves, to live fully, to enjoy all that had been given to them. The stars at night spoke to them of God's greatness. Each point of light was a sun like the sun that warmed their days, but impossibly distant. God had made all of them, countless suns scattered across the vast expanse of heaven. The universe was larger than they could comprehend, yet God knew every star, had placed each one exactly where He intended. If God could create and sustain such vastness, how much more could they trust Him with their lives, with their needs, with their future? The same power that had spoken stars into existence was the power that sustained them. The same wisdom that had ordered the heavens was the wisdom that guided them. The same love that had created beauty on such a cosmic scale was the love that cared for them individually. During the day, the sun moved across the sky in its appointed path, rising in the east, traveling overhead, setting in the west. Its light was constant, reliable, dependable. It marked the passage of time, divided day from night, provided the energy that made all life possible. Plants turned toward it, drawing strength from its rays. The warmth it provided made the garden comfortable, pleasant, perfect for life. At night, the moon took the sun's place, though its light was gentler, softer, reflected rather than generated. The moon changed its appearance, growing from a thin crescent to a full circle, then diminishing again in an orderly cycle. This cycle marked longer periods of time, providing another way to measure the passage of days and weeks. Adam and his wife began to recognize these patterns, to understand the rhythms of creation. They learned when the sun would rise and when it would set. They learned the phases of the moon. They learned the cycles of plant growth, when seeds would sprout, when flowers would bloom, when fruit would ripen. They learned the behaviors of animals, which were active in the day and which in the night. This knowledge was not burdensome or complex. It came naturally, easily, as they lived in harmony with creation. They were part of the pattern, not outside observers trying to understand something foreign. They were embedded in creation, participants in its ongoing life, and so understanding came intuitively. The garden provided everything they needed, but it also provided things they simply enjoyed. There were flowers that served no purpose except to be beautiful. There were birds whose songs brought no practical benefit, but were lovely to hear. There were sunsets and starry nights that could not be used or consumed, but were wonderful to experience. God had not made a merely functional world. He had made a beautiful world, a world that appealed to the senses, that brought delight, that was pleasant to inhabit. This revealed something about God himself, that he valued beauty, that he wanted his creatures to experience joy, that he had made the world not just to sustain life, but to make life worth living. Adam and his wife responded to this beauty with appreciation and wonder. They never took it for granted, never became so accustomed to it that they ceased to notice. Each sunset was a fresh marvel. Each flower was a new delight. Each bird's song was a gift to be received with gratitude. They would sometimes try to create beauty themselves, arranging flowers or stones or branches in patterns that pleased them. These were small acts of creativity, reflections of the greater creativity of God. They could not create something from nothing as God had done, but they could rearrange what he had made, could bring order and beauty to to small corners of the garden. God seemed to delight in these efforts. When they would show him something they had made, he would examine it carefully, would comment on what they had done well, would offer gentle suggestions for how it might be improved. He was teaching them, nurturing their own creative impulses, encouraging them to participate in the ongoing work of bringing beauty and order to creation. Time continued its steady flow. Days followed days, each one similar to the last, yet each one unique. The sameness was not monotonous, but comforting, a steady rhythm that provided security and peace. They knew what to expect, could anticipate the patterns of their days, and found satisfaction in the routine of their life. Yet, within this routine, there was always something new to discover. The garden was vast enough that they had not explored every part of it. There were always new places to see, new plants to examine, new animals to observe. The sameness of the days was the framework within which newness could be appreciated. Their relationship with each other deepened as time passed. They learned each other's thoughts and feelings, could often anticipate what the other would say or do. They developed ways of communicating that went beyond words, understanding each other through gestures, expressions, the quality of silence between them. This deepening intimacy brought increasing joy. They were becoming truly one flesh, united not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. What affected one affected the other. What brought joy to one brought joy to both. What concerned one concerned both. They were individuals, yes, distinct persons with their own thoughts and feelings, but they were also a unity, a partnership, a single entity in two persons. Their nakedness was a symbol of this complete openness between them. Nothing was hidden, nothing was concealed. They stood before each other exactly as they were, vulnerable and exposed, yet completely safe. There was no fear of judgment, no worry about being rejected or found lacking. They accepted each other fully, loved each other completely, delighted in each other entirely. This was the way God had intended relationship to be. Open, honest, intimate, secure. Without pretense, without defense, without the barriers that pride and fear erect. They could be weak with each other, could express doubt or confusion or uncertainty, and find support and understanding. They could be strong with each other, could share insights and knowledge and wisdom, and find appreciation and respect. The tree of life stood as a constant reminder of God's provision and care. Its fruit sustained their immortal lives, kept them in the state of perfection and wholeness they had been given. They ate from it regularly, not from fear of death, but as an act of receiving what God had provided. Each time they ate its fruit, they were in a sense renewing their life, recommitting themselves to the gift God had given them. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood as a constant reminder of God's authority and their choice. could obey or disobey. They could honor the boundary or cross it. The choice was theirs, and in having that choice, they had dignity, they had freedom, they had the capacity for real relationship with God. A relationship with no possibility of disobedience would not be a real relationship. It would be programming, automation, compulsion. But God had not made them as machines that could only do what they were programmed to do. He had made them as persons capable of choice, able to decide for themselves what they would do. So far, they had chosen obedience, not from fear of punishment, but from love and trust. They obeyed because they loved God, because they trusted that His commands were for their good, because they had no desire to do anything that would displease Him or harm themselves. The possibility of disobedience existed, but it seemed remote, almost unthinkable. Why would they disobey? They had everything they needed. God had been nothing but good to them. His commands were not burdensome. The restriction He had placed was minimal compared to the freedom He had given. There seemed to be no reason to disobey, no motivation to cross the boundary He had established. And yet the possibility remained. The tree stood there in the garden. Its fruit was visible and accessible. The choice existed moment by moment, day by day. They could obey or disobey. They could honor God's word or reject it. The freedom was real, and therefore the obedience was meaningful. In a sense, their obedience was being tested every day, not in the sense that God was trying to catch them in wrongdoing, but in the sense that their choice was real and ongoing. Each day they chose not to eat from the forbidden tree was a day they chose obedience, chose trust, chose to honor God's command. This ongoing choice strengthened their character. It established patterns of thought and behavior that reinforced their relationship with God. It trained them in faithfulness, in self-control, in the discipline of living within boundaries. It prepared them for the larger responsibilities that would come when they eventually left the garden and filled the earth. God had not placed them in a world without choices, without challenges, without the need for discernment and decision. He had placed them in a world where their choices mattered, where their decisions had consequences, where they had the dignity of being real agents with real freedom. This was love, true love. Not the love that controls and manipulates and removes all possibility of rejection, but the love that trusts, that gives freedom, that allows the beloved to choose whether to return that love or reject it. God loved them enough to give them the freedom to walk away, and in that freedom, their love for Him had meaning and value. The garden was a place of learning as well as living. Every day brought opportunities to understand more about creation, about themselves, about God. Adam would observe how water flowed downhill, always seeking the lowest place. He would notice how plants turned toward the sun, following its path across the sky. He would watch as seeds fell from trees, and over time sprouted into new plants. The woman learned the properties of different herbs and plants. Some were sweet, others bitter. Some had strong scents, others were mild. Some grew quickly, others slowly. Each plant had its own character, its own nature, and she learned to recognize them, to understand them, to appreciate their unique qualities. Together, they learned about the animals. They learned which animals preferred the water and which preferred dry land. They learned which moved quickly and which moved slowly. They learned the sounds each animal made, could identify creatures by their calls and cries. They learned which animals lived in groups and which preferred solitude. This knowledge was not merely factual or intellectual. It was relational knowledge, knowledge that came from living among the animals, from interacting with them daily, from caring for them as part of tending the garden. They knew the animals not as subjects to be studied, but as fellow creatures, part of the same creation, sharing the same garden home. The river that flowed through Eden was a source of endless fascination. They would sit by its banks and watch the water flow past, never the same water twice, yet always the river. They would try to see to the bottom in the deeper parts, where the riverbed dropped away and the water became darker, mysterious. They would follow the river upstream, tracing it toward its source in the heart of Eden. At the source, water bubbled up from the ground, emerging from some deep place beneath the earth. It was cool and clear and pure, the freshest water in all the garden. They would drink from the source and taste the essence of the river, the beginning of all the waters that flowed through Eden and out into the 4 great rivers that watered the earth beyond. Following the river downstream, they would watch as it broadened and deepened, fed by smaller streams that joined it along its course. They would see how the river carved the land, shaping valleys, creating banks, depositing soil in some places, and carrying it away from others. The river was both constant and changing, always there, yet always in motion. The 4 rivers that flowed out from Eden carried water to distant lands. The Pishon flowed to the land of Havilah, where gold could be found. Adam and his wife had seen gold brought by the river, small flakes and nuggets that glinted in the sun. It was beautiful, precious, a metal unlike any other. They understood that it had value, though in the garden they had no use for wealth or precious metals. Everything they needed was freely provided. The Gihon flowed to the land of Cush. The Hiddekel flowed toward Assyria. The Euphrates flowed out to regions they had not yet explored. These rivers suggested a world beyond Eden, lands they had not yet seen, places that were part of God's creation, but outside the boundaries of the garden. Someday, perhaps, they would explore those lands. They would follow the rivers to their ends, would see what lay beyond the horizon, would discover what God had made in the wider world. But for now, Eden was enough. It contained everything they needed, everything they wanted, everything they could desire. The cycle of day and night provided rhythm to their lives. Morning was a time of fresh beginning. The sun would rise, the birds would begin to sing, the garden would wake to new life. This was a good time for work, when they were rested and energetic, when the light was clear and the air was cool. Midday brought heat and intensity. The sun would be directly overhead, its light and warmth at their strongest. This was a good time to rest, to seek shade, to drink from the river, to eat fruit and restore their energy. They would often spend the middle of the day in quiet conversation, in contemplation, in simply being still. Afternoon was a time of continued activity, but gentler than morning. The worst heat had passed. The sun was descending toward the west. The light was becoming golden and soft. This was when they would often complete the work they had begun in the morning, when they would prepare for evening, when they would begin to look forward to the coolness that would come. Evening was a time of winding down, of transition from activity to rest. The sun would set in a blaze of color. The shadows would lengthen. The sounds of the garden would change. They would finish their work, would clean their hands in the river, would gather fruit for a simple meal. This was often when God would walk in the garden, when they would meet him and talk with him and walk with him in the gathering darkness. Night was a time of rest and peace. The stars would appear, the moon would rise, the garden would settle into quietness. They would lie together and talk softly, reviewing the day, sharing thoughts and feelings, making plans for tomorrow. Eventually, they would drift into sleep, secure in the knowledge that God watched over them, that the garden would be there when they woke, that tomorrow would bring another day of life and blessing. Dreams came to them in sleep, though these were not the confused, anxious dreams that would later trouble humanity. These were peaceful dreams, pleasant images that flowed through their minds as they rested. Sometimes they would dream of the places they had been in the garden, reliving experiences they had enjoyed. Sometimes they would dream of things they had not yet seen, imaginings of what might be or what could be. Morning would come again, and they would wake refreshed, ready for another day. The cycle would repeat, endless and comforting, providing structure and rhythm to their life in paradise. They had no concept of boredom or tedium. Each day was similar to the last, yes, but each day was also fresh and new. The garden was too vast, too complex, too full of wonder for them to exhaust its possibilities. There was always something they had not noticed before, some detail they had overlooked, some connection they had not made. Their minds were sharp and clear, unclouded by the confusion and distortion that would later afflict humanity. They could think clearly, reason carefully, understand deeply. They could remember everything they had learned, could apply knowledge from one situation to another, could see patterns and connections with ease. This intellectual capacity was one aspect of being made in God's image. God was a God of order and reason, of wisdom and understanding. He had made them with minds that could comprehend creation, could understand truth, could know Him. Their thoughts were a gift from God, a way of participating in His own nature, of reflecting His own character. They used this gift well. They thought about what they observed, pondered the meanings and implications of what they learned, sought to understand the deeper purposes behind what they saw. They were not content with surface knowledge, but desired to understand truly, to comprehend deeply, to know fully. Their emotions, too, were gifts from God. They felt joy and delight, contentment and peace, love and affection. These feelings were pure, uncomplicated by the negative emotions that would later arise. They knew no fear, no anxiety, no anger, no jealousy, no sadness. Their emotional life was entirely positive, filled only with good feelings, healthy responses to a good world. When they looked at each other, they felt love, deep and abiding love. When they looked at the garden, they felt appreciation and wonder. When they thought about God, they felt gratitude and awe. When they considered their life, they felt satisfaction and joy. Every emotion they experienced drew them closer to what was good and true and beautiful. Their will, too, was a gift from God. They could choose, could decide, could direct their own actions. This capacity for choice was perhaps the most important aspect of bearing God's image. God was free, unconstrained, able to do as He pleased. He had given them a measure of that same freedom, making them responsible agents, capable of self-direction. So far, they had used their will to choose obedience, to honor God, to care for the garden, to love each other. These choices came naturally, easily, without struggle or inner conflict. What they wanted to do aligned perfectly with what they should do. There was no gap between desire and duty, no tension between what they wished and what was right. This harmony of mind, emotion, and will was another aspect of paradise. They were integrated persons, whole and complete, all parts of their being working together in perfect coordination. They were not divided against themselves, not torn by competing desires, not confused about what they should do. They knew what was right. They wanted what was right, and they did what was right. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood as a potential disruption to this harmony. To eat from that tree would be to introduce into themselves knowledge they did not currently possess, knowledge of good and evil, the understanding that things could be other than they were, the awareness that what was right might not be what was desired. But they did not think much about this. The tree was there, yes, but it was one tree among many. God had forbidden it, so they avoided it. They had no desire for the knowledge it offered, because they had no concept of what that knowledge would be, or why it might be desirable. They were content with what they knew, with who they were, with the state they were in. Innocence is perhaps the best word to describe them, not ignorance, for they were learning and growing in knowledge every day, but innocence, a purity of heart and mind that had not yet been tainted by evil, that had not yet been complicated by knowledge of wrongdoing. They knew good because everything they experienced was good. They did not know evil because evil did not exist in their experience. This innocence gave them a perspective on creation that was pure and undistorted. They saw things as they truly were, not through the lens of prejudice or preconception. They saw the garden as beautiful because it was beautiful. They saw each other as good because they were good. They saw God as loving because he was loving. Their perception matched reality perfectly. In time, God had said they would have children. Sons and daughters would be born in the garden, would grow up in this paradise, would learn from their parents as their parents had learned from God. These children would also bear God's image, would also have minds and emotions and wills, would also have the capacity to know God and walk with him. The thought of children filled them with anticipation. They imagined what it would be like to hold a baby, to teach a child, to watch a son or daughter grow and develop. They imagined the garden filled with the sounds of children's laughter, with the energy and curiosity of young ones exploring and learning. Their children would spread out across the earth, carrying with them the knowledge and wisdom they had gained. They would tend other gardens, would care for other lands, would fill the earth with people who walked with God and honored his creation. Humanity would multiply and flourish, fulfilling the command God had given to be fruitful and fill the earth. But all of this was future. For now, it was just the two of them, learning to be husband and wife, learning to tend the garden, learning to walk with God. They were the first humans, the beginning of humanity, the foundation on which all else would be built. What they learned, what they did, how they lived, would shape everything that came after. This was a responsibility they bore lightly, without anxiety or pressure. They did not feel burdened by the weight of being the first. They simply lived day by day, doing what was before them to do, enjoying what they had been given, trusting God to guide them and provide for them. The seasons in Eden were mild and gentle. There was no harsh winter, no scorching summer. The temperature remained comfortable year-round. Rain fell periodically, soft and warm, watering the garden and keeping everything green and growing. The rain was never violent or destructive, never too much or too little, but always exactly what was needed. After rain, the air would smell fresh and clean, carrying with it the sense of wet earth and growing things. Droplets would cling to leaves and petals, catching the light and sparkling like jewels. The river would run fuller and faster, its sound louder and more energetic, Everything would seem renewed, refreshed, brought to new life by the water. They would walk through the garden after rain, feeling the wet grass beneath their feet, touching leaves heavy with water, watching as drops fell from branches and splashed into puddles. They would drink the rainwater that collected in the curves of large leaves, tasting its purity, its freshness. They would stand with faces upturned to the sky, letting the last few drops fall on their skin, cool and pleasant. The diversity of creation never ceased to amaze them. No two flowers were exactly alike, even on the same plant. No two animals were identical, even among the same species. No two sunsets painted the sky in quite the same way. God seemed to delight in variety, in endless permutations and combinations, in subtle differences that made each thing unique. This diversity reflected something about God himself, about his infinite creativity, his endless imagination. He was not limited to a few patterns or forms. He could create infinitely, without repetition, without exhaustion of ideas. Every detail of creation bore his personal touch, his individual attention, his creative genius. Adam and his wife tried to imitate this creativity in small ways. They would arrange stones in patterns, would weave grasses together to make simple objects, would experiment with arranging flowers in ways that pleased them. These were small acts, nothing compared to God's creative power, but they were participations in his nature, reflections of his image in them. God never discouraged these efforts. He seemed pleased when they created, when they brought order and beauty to small corners of the garden. He would examine what they had made with genuine interest, would comment thoughtfully, would encourage them to continue developing these skills. He was teaching them to be creative beings, to participate with him in the ongoing work of caring for and beautifying creation. Communication with God was effortless. They spoke to him, and he spoke to them directly, clearly, without confusion or misunderstanding. His voice was recognizable, distinct, unmistakable. When he spoke, they knew it was him. When they spoke, they knew he heard and understood. Prayer was not yet a formal practice, not a ritualized activity. It was simply conversation, ongoing dialogue with the God who walked with them. They talked to him throughout the day, sharing thoughts and observations, asking questions, expressing gratitude, and he responded, sometimes with words, sometimes with his presence, sometimes with actions that answered needs they had not yet voiced. This intimate communication with God was perhaps the greatest blessing of Eden, more than the perfect environment, more than the provision of every need, more than the absence of pain or struggle. The ability to know God directly, to hear his voice, to walk with him, to be in his presence without fear or barrier. This was paradise. They had been created for this, made for this, designed for this. Relationship with God was not an add-on to their existence, not a bonus feature. It was the core of who they were, the purpose for which they had been made. They were most fully themselves, most fully human, most fully alive, when they were in fellowship with their Creator. Everything else flowed from this central relationship. Their love for each other was sustained by their love for God. Their care for creation was an expression of their obedience to God. Their work in the garden was service to God. Their joy in life was joy in what God had given them. Every aspect of their existence was rooted in and flowed from their relationship with Him. They understood this not as a theological concept, but as a lived reality. They knew that apart from God they had nothing, were nothing, could do nothing. They knew that every breath they drew was His gift, that every moment of life was sustained by His power, that every good thing they experienced came from His hand. This knowledge did not make them feel small or insignificant. Rather, it made them feel secure, valued, loved. They mattered to God. He cared about them. He was intimately involved in their lives. They were not alone in the universe, not abandoned to make their own way. They were children of God, and He was their Father, caring for them with perfect love. The seventh day, the day God had blessed and sanctified, remained special. On this day, they would rest from their work in the garden, would spend more time in contemplation and communion with God, would reflect on the goodness of all He had made. This day of rest was not enforced, not legalistic, but natural and right. They wanted to set aside one day to focus entirely on God, to remember His works, to celebrate His goodness. On the seventh day, they would often walk through the entire garden, reviewing everything that grew there, remembering the work of the past 6 days, seeing what had changed and what had remained the same. They would stop at favorite places, would sit for long periods in contemplation, would talk quietly with each other and with God. This rhythm of work and rest, of activity and contemplation, was built into the fabric of creation itself. God had modeled it in His own creative work, working for 6 days and resting on the seventh. He had established it as a pattern for His creatures to follow. It was good to work, to create, to be productive. And it was good to rest, to reflect, to simply be without doing. Time stretched ahead of them, unlimited and endless. They had been made to live forever, to never die, to exist eternally in fellowship with God. Death was not part of their experience, not part of their understanding. They knew life only as something continuous, ongoing, permanent. The threat of death existed in God's warning about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, He had said. But death was an abstract concept to them, something they could not imagine, could not picture, could not understand. They had never seen death, never experienced loss, never known the end of anything. Life was all they knew. So they took God's warning seriously, not because they understood what death was, but because they trusted God. If he said eating from that tree would result in death, then it was to be avoided. They did not need to understand the full implications to know that obedience was the right choice. Their trust in God was absolute and unquestioning. He had never given them reason to doubt him, never failed to provide for them, never spoken anything but truth to them. They knew him to be good, reliable, trustworthy. His word was sure. What he said was true. What he promised he would do. This trust made obedience easy. It removed the burden of trying to figure everything out on their own, of having to evaluate every command to see if it made sense, of having to understand the reasons before they would comply. They could simply trust that God knew what was best, that his commands were for their good, that obedience would lead to blessing. And so life continued in Eden, day following day, each one full of work and rest, learning and growing, fellowship with each other and with God. The garden flourished under their care. The animals multiplied and thrived. The river flowed steadily, providing water for all living things. The sun and moon marked the passage of time, day and night, light and darkness, in their appointed rhythms. Everything was as it should be. Everything was good, very good, exactly as God had declared when he completed his work of creation. This was the world as God intended it, the life he designed for humanity, the relationship he desired with his creatures. Adam and his wife lived in this paradise, enjoyed its blessings, walked in its beauty, knowing nothing but goodness, experiencing nothing but peace. They were innocent, whole, complete. They were in right relationship with God, with each other, with creation. They were fully alive, fully human, fully blessed. This was Eden. This was the beginning. This was how creation started, how humanity began, how God established the world and gave it to his creatures as a gift. Everything that would come later, all of history, all of human experience, would flow from this beginning, would be measured against this standard, would be compared to this perfect origin. For now, in these first days, there was only peace, only joy, only life in all its fullness. The garden waited, beautiful and serene. The man and woman walked its paths, tended its plants, enjoyed its fruits. And God was with them, walking in the cool of the day, speaking with them, blessing them, loving them. This was creation. This was the world God made and declared very good. And for a time, everything remained as he had made it, perfect and whole and complete.